Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving straight into a masterclass explainer on a subject that is, well, it's just absolutely fascinating. Applied epistemology. I'm incredibly excited to unpack this with you because we're going to look at the complex and honestly often invisible social realities of exactly how we know what we know. So we're completely ditching that old school image of a lonely philosopher just sitting in an armchair, right? Instead, we're stepping right into the messy, real world of how we humans actually gather and process information.
To kick things off, let me just throw a question out there. How much of your knowledge was gained completely 100% alone? I mean, did you sit down and discover the laws of physics all by yourself? Have you independently verified the geography of a country you've literally never been to? Probably not, right? The truth is, almost everything you know relies on a massive, deeply interconnected social network. Very, very little of what's currently in our heads is the result of pure solo investigation.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the social nature of knowledge. Second, evaluating testimony and peers. Third, asking if groups can actually have beliefs. Fourth, what exactly is standpoint epistemology? And finally, the two types of epistemic injustice. All right, starting right off with Section 1, the social nature of knowledge.
You know, for centuries, traditional philosophy was pretty much obsessed with the isolated individual, like what can one single person figure out? But applied epistemology, it completely changes the game. This is basically the practice of using philosophical methods to investigate practical social issues and systems. We're looking at real-world setups, think about the sciences, the court system, or even democratic elections, to see if they're actually structured in a way that reliably leads us to true beliefs. We are taking high-level theory and applying it to real collectives, like juries, to see how they actually hash things out.
And nestled right under that umbrella, we find social epistemology. This field takes a hard look at the fact that humans are, at our core, social animals. Because of that, our dependence on others makes gaining knowledge incredibly efficient. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single generation. But it also makes things a whole lot more complicated. Because suddenly, the reliability of other people is the absolute most important factor in whether our beliefs are actually true. Which leads us perfectly into the idea of testimony. Now, in philosophy, testimony isn't just somebody swearing to tell the truth on a witness stand. Anytime you believe something just because you read it or heard it, you're relying on testimony. Just think about the sheer layers upon layers of trust happening when you sit in a classroom. The student has to trust the teacher's testimony. The teacher is trusting the textbook writer. The textbook writer is trusting the original researchers. Our entire educational system is basically built on this massive, cascading social reliance.
Moving right along to Section 2. Evaluating testimony and peers.
So if we rely so heavily on other people's testimony, how on earth do we filter out the bad info? Because, let's face it, people misremember things. They use terrible reasoning. And yeah, sometimes they just outright lie. To help fix this, philosophers give us a sort of checklist for evaluating an authority. A truly trustworthy source needs to be honest, unbiased, rational, well-informed, and clear-headed. When we're looking at a so-called authority, we need to be asking, is there genuine expertise here? Is there a consensus among the experts? And does this person actually agree with that consensus? We literally have to audit the sources we're letting into our brains. But what happens when the person you're talking to isn't some towering, world-renowned expert, but someone on your exact level? Well, we call this an epistemic peer. That's a person with the exact same cognitive ability, the same evidence, and the same background knowledge as you in a very specific domain. Now, what's really interesting here is that your peer status with someone isn't just locked in forever. It completely shifts depending on whatever it is you're talking about. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you and your best friend are chatting about baseball. You both watch the exact same amount of games, you pore over the same stats. You are epistemic peers. You're on totally equal footing. But then, the topic shifts to baking. You barely know how to turn your oven on, right? But your friend actually went to culinary school. Boom. Suddenly, you're the novice and they are the undisputed authority. That dynamic shifts instantly based entirely on the domain. Okay, so if someone is an expert and you're not, you should probably just adjust your belief when they correct you. Makes sense. But here's a question for you. When an epistemic peer, someone with the exact same evidence and brain power as you, when they disagree with you, what should you do? Social epistemologists actually fiercely debate this. Some argue you should always modify your conviction, kind of meet in the middle. But others say, hey, peer disagreement doesn't automatically mean you are the one who messed up. It's this fascinating puzzle about when to compromise and when to confidently hold your ground.
All right, let's look at Section 3. Can groups have beliefs?
We've talked a lot about individuals and peers, but let's scale this whole thing up. Can an entire collective actually hold a unified belief? We do attribute beliefs to groups all the time in everyday conversation, don't we? We'll say things like, the United States believes in freedom, or scientists believe in climate change. A perfect case study here is the U.S. Supreme Court. When the court decides an issue with a 6-3 vote, we don't just say those 6 specific judges hold that view, we legally attribute that belief to the entire court as a single entity, even though, clearly, not every single member agreed.
One way philosophers actually explain this is through something called the commitment view. This theory basically says that group belief doesn't require every single individual member to personally hold the idea in their own head. Instead, members are jointly committed to a belief merely by virtue of being in that group. It's like joining a specific group, say a religious organization gathering around specific dogma, creates this normative constraint. You are expected to emulate the group's beliefs simply because you chose to be part of that collective body.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. What is standpoint epistemology?
If groups are the ones generating and validating knowledge, we have to look really closely at how social power dictates who is even deemed a reliable expert in the first place. And that brings us to standpoint epistemology. This is the theory that an individual's social status uniquely influences their epistemic position and their access to knowledge. The core argument here is just absolutely vital. The relative power of individuals heavily influences who we consider to be a reliable source. And when we exclude marginalized or less powerful perspectives, we aren't just hurting people's feelings, we are fundamentally harming our own ability to find the objective truth.
Think about it like this. Imagine a factory president who wants to cut down on waste, but they only consult their department heads. Now, the president has a standpoint that sees broad, high-level efficiency, but they are entirely missing the irreplaceable day-to-day insights of the manual worker right down there on the floor. That worker sees daily, on-the-ground realities that the president is completely blind to. So without both standpoints, the president's knowledge of their own factory is just objectively incomplete.
We see this play out in the social sciences, too. For example, if an anthropologist in the 1950s wanted to accurately study unequal power structures in the American South, and they only interviewed white citizens, well, their data would be woefully inadequate, right? Black citizens, precisely because of their marginalized position, had a significantly better epistemic standpoint to actually observe and describe the true realities of those institutional power dynamics.
And this brilliantly illustrates that even the so-called hard sciences are absolutely not immune to this. For decades, heart disease research focused heavily, almost exclusively on men. So the medical community logically established chest pain as the defining symptom. But women often experience a heart attack completely differently, sometimes with jaw pain or nausea. Because researchers excluded the female standpoint from their core data sets, doctors failed to properly diagnose women, which resulted in deadly consequences. Systemic biases in who we listen to literally distort objective science.
Which leads us to our final stop today, Section 5, 2 types of epistemic injustice.
So what exactly happens when these systemic biases become formalized in society? Well, the British philosopher Miranda Fricker coined a groundbreaking term for this back in 2007, epistemic injustice. This happens when valuable perspectives are systematically excluded from social and scientific discourse. It involves the unfair silencing, misrepresentation, or deep distrust of certain groups, which basically prevents them from participating equally in the sharing of knowledge.
Fricker splits this whole problem into 2 distinct, highly damaging categories. First up is testimonial injustice, which is when someone's word is unfairly ignored or distrusted. And the second is hermeneutical injustice. That one happens when a society literally lacks the language or the concepts to adequately capture someone's experience. Let's break both of these down.
Testimonial injustice often happens simply by virtue of someone's membership in a marginalized group. For instance, extensive research shows that pain reports given by Black patients are systematically taken less seriously by medical professionals compared to white patients with similar injuries, which results in them receiving less pain medication. That is testimonial injustice in action. The source material also notes that this occurs through systematic misrepresentation. For example, the phrase "Black Lives Matter" was intended to affirm the value of Black lives, but when a counterphrase like "All Lives Matter" is deployed in response, it unfairly implies that the original movement meant only Black Lives Matter, and that systematically distorts the intended meaning of their testimony.
Then we have hermeneutical injustice. So the crucial point here is that sometimes the gap in our knowledge is literally linguistic. Just think about the workplace before the concept of sexual harassment was officially introduced. Women were experiencing unwanted attention and exclusion, but society didn't have a specific word for it. Without the proper vocabulary, victims suffered quietly, and society couldn't even process their lived reality. Coining the actual term filled a massive, vital epistemic gap.
Wow, okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. Everything from evaluating our peers to understanding how raw power shapes our shared reality. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final Socratic question to help you audit your own epistemic biases. Take a look at the groups you belong to and the experts you naturally trust. Whose perspective are you missing? And how do the power dynamics around you actively shape what you consider to be the truth? Keep asking those tough questions.